I am about to tell you about a stage in my life that continues to affect my family, a story that my elementary school mates at that time continue to talk about, and although I lost contact with most of them, recently in a meeting, someone I did not know asked me if I was that child who had happened everything so many years ago. On the other hand, my family insists that what I am going to tell you did not happen and that everything is a product of my imagination, that it is just one way in which my brain dealt with that trauma from my childhood. Even so, I am sure that many of those who have lived in the area of my childhood will know the legends and even the people I am about to name. I remember everything perfectly as if it had been yesterday, just a few weeks before I finished my catechism and made my first communion. Pedro, my brother who was 3 years older than me, had not made his first communion. For some reason he always refused and never wanted to explain why. However, he never wanted to tell my mother the reason for not doing it, therefore the fact that I did it even became a kind of obsession for her. The first times I went to catechism, her emotion was so great that she took me herself and she was there helping in the church and taking care of Lucia, my little sister who was 3 years old in those years. However, after a few times, Lucia began to cry as soon as we approached the church, which was located on a steep climb in the Colonia Guaycura de Tijuana. She said that she was afraid of the ladies in black, referring to that. According to us, the nuns who lived in the convent next to the church. Thus, in spite of my mother, she let me be accompanied by a boy who lived 2 blocks from my house, since her father always took him. However, he only took us once and after that, he no longer accompanied us, and it was then that we began the journey to the church, each day of catechism by ourselves, Marcos and I. There was something strange in those days. Maybe there were not as many people in the colony as today, but, even so, I remember the tours we did, what seemed to be a deserted colony when only the strangest inhabitants dared to go out. On one occasion, we left the church late, well, not so late, but long enough for it to begin to get dark, and we were urged to get home. That day, instead of going down the main street, we took one of the alternative paths. It was a bit dangerous, but the path was shorter. On the way, we passed the elementary school, which was a few blocks from the church, and a sound that came from within caught our attention. Hearing something late at night, in a closed school, made my first reaction to run. A few seconds later, I turned around and saw that my friend was not running next to me. I stopped to observe, and in the distance I saw Marcos, who was leaning out and climbing on the fence looking into the school at the 6th grade classrooms, very close to the main entrance. I came back slowly, and between murmurs I asked him what he was watching. He answered immediately, "Shut up, there are going to be us." Then I saw what he was referring to. Inside the classroom, 3 meters from the school fence, and barely illuminated by the light of the street lamp, the figure or silhouette of a nun looking out, motionless, macabre. It was then that I started running again, this time much stronger and as fast as the extra kilos I had at that time allowed me, but this time, I did feel Marcos's footsteps running to my right, when, a block later and without stopping, I asked him what the hell would someone do inside the school that hour. But when I turned around, I realized that it was not Marcos who was running next to me. A child with strange clothes was running next to me. He was blonde and he kept looking at me and smiling. So my instinct was to run faster and turn onto the next street, even though that was taking me away from the way home at the moment. But that child, without making an effort, ran at the same speed as me, laughing at me. Finally, when I got to the main street, I realized that I had finally lost it. Then, totally exhausted, I stopped to rest. After catching my breath a little, I ran from lamp to take advantage of the darkness of the streets of that time. Finally, I managed to get closer to my street, almost going unnoticed, and a block from home, I saw my mother hurrying along with Lucia. She was obviously worried, because it was late and I was not coming. When she saw me, I noticed that her gaze lit up with pleasure, but immediately changed to angry eyes, and she began to scold me for the concern I had caused her. She, very annoyed, told me, "Now you go up to the church and look for your brother." Immediately afterwards my blood ran cold, because the least I wanted was to go up again, but, when I tried to explain what had happened to me, she only scolded me without believing anything. I, crying, began my journey again, going up through the neighborhood to look for Pedro, who had come up to look for me. A few blocks later, I heard a scream that put me on alert, and suddenly, 2 figures came out of the darkness and were running towards me at full speed. I wanted to run in the direction of my house, but out of fear, I think, my legs got absolutely awkward and I just felt like I tripped. Meanwhile, the figures were getting so close that he even heard their breathing. A figure ran over me and the other took me by the arms and I got up. Fortunately, it was my brother Pedro, and without saying anything, I knew that something was chasing them. I realized that the figure running in front of us was my friend Marcos. He turned around when he got to the street from my house. He ran into it, without asking permission, and it was more than obvious, because he was very afraid, in addition to the fact that he knew that he would not be able to run at that other pace. 2 more streets to get home. When we all entered the house, Marcos's face was covered in blood. And my mother took care of him immediately while she ordered us to call his father. Marcos would not stop crying, and the more they wiped the blood from his face, the more terrified I was, and it seemed as if a rocket had exploded in his face and had pieces of skin hanging down. Unfortunately for him, his father was not there. He did not respond to calls, but a few minutes later one of his neighbors arrived and they took him to the emergency hospital. On the other hand, my mother kept asking us what had happened, but I had no idea, and Pedro swore that he did not know what had happened to him. I want to believe that because of the scare that we all had, my mother did not insist more and prepared a dinner for us very light and send us to sleep. So Pedro came over to tell me that he was going to tell me what he had seen, but I had to swear not to tell my mother. I nodded and he told me what had happened. My mother was very worried about me, so she sent him to look for me. He ran up the neighborhood and was more or less halfway between the house and the church, almost arriving to school, when he heard the sound of something passing over him, like flying. He looked up, but there was nothing. He kept walking and barely advanced a few steps. The voice of a child called him from behind his back. "This way it is." When he turned around he saw a boy who was pointing to the street, and from his description, it was the same boy who had run beside me when I was leaving school. "He is one of the gypsy children, you sure have seen it." He told me what he saw when he ran towards that street. A lump right in the middle of it, a black lump that moved on something or someone. Even though the image was macabre and impressive, he took a stone and threw it, thinking that maybe it was me they were attacking. He was a very strange figure, but, without a doubt, he was a human figure. However, that did not make him feel less dread, but on the contrary, it filled him with immense terror. By throwing the second stone at him, he managed to hit that thing that screamed and ran off to the other end of the street, jumping enormously. Pedro ran towards the figure of a bloody child, and when he arrived he realized it was Marcos. He picked him up and asked him about me, and he told him that I had managed to run down the main street. Marcos looked at Pedro's back and, barely being able to open his eyes because of the blood, and without saying anything, he ran in the opposite direction, like a soul that the devil carries. Pedro turned and saw a group of 4 nuns approaching him in a row, in a completely bizarre way, with their hands joined in front, as if praying, and as if they were taking very short steps but approaching at an impressive speed. It was then that he also started running, and after a few blocks, he found me walking backwards in fear. It was then that I slipped and he picked me up and we reached home right behind Marcos. My mother is not going to believe us, but I had already seen them before, and they dress like nuns, and sometimes, they approach the church, walk around and stare. He told me with a voice full of amazement and fear. "Do you know why I didn't make my first communion?" He asked me, "Why don't you think God?" I said, more in a questioning tone than answering with confidence, "No." He went for them. "I'm going to tell you," and then he began with his story. "I went to catechism classes too. They were even earlier then. We stayed to play soccer in the space next to the church, right in front of the convent. The nuns were very friendly, and even sometimes, we would knock on their door and they gave glasses of water to all the children. So once we were surprised by a group of nuns dressed completely in black, who seemed to curse us in a low voice while we played soccer, but they were not on the side of the church, but on the side, in the street that passes up from the field where we played. They really said bad things, very bad things. We were ignoring them until one of the smaller children approached them to pick up a ball, and one of them ran towards him, as if to take it, and he started running towards us, crying while the other nuns got away. They laughed out loud, almost screaming as we watched them behind us. Immediately afterwards, the door of the convent was opened and one of the nuns yelled at us to go into the church. We all ran, but I managed to turn around and 2 young nuns came out of the convent hurrying, almost threatening towards the other nuns who were next to the church grounds, and when they saw them they began to run, but, laughing horrible. I remember then that one of our catechists approached. She was just a teenager too, and she asked us not to play again so late, much less when they were there. I asked her then if those nuns in black were bad, and she said, "Of course not. They are not nuns, they are crazy people who just wanted to scare us." At that moment my brother paused in his story, took a deep breath, as if he had reached a painful moment, and then continued, "But I'm sure they were worse than she thought, that they weren't just looking for scare us." Shortly after we saw them for the first time, Alan's thing happened. Pedro had himself back in his story, and I knew why. I knew what he was referring to. Alan was a roommate of his who had passed away. They did not tell me well how he died because he was very young, but I knew that he had been in a very ugly way, and among the boys of first school they told completely crazy things about it. For those who do not know the Guaycura neighborhood, it is on a kind of small hill and ended in a ravine on one of its sides. These ravines led to a stream with a dirt road next to it. Today there is already a boulevard of the most trafficked in Tijuana, but at the beginning of the 90s, none of that existed. There in the stream they had found Alan's body, and I well remember that several children gathered from the ravines where the streets of the colony ended to see all the movement of patrols and onlookers who came to the place. Alan was playing soccer with us that day we saw them, my brother continued, and then he saw her again, one night, very close to the school. When he said that, I remembered the vision that Marcos and I had had at school a while ago. I thought about what would have happened to Marcos if my brother had not arrived when they threw him in the street, and even if they make fun of me, that is the easiest part to believe. From there, the most macabre and bizarre things of my experience happened.